السلام عليكم ورحمة الله وبركاته. أهلا وسهلا بكم في حلقة جديدة من جسور. وضيفي اليوم هو الأستاذ الدكتور شليم، أستاذ العلاقات الدولية. Welcome, Professor Shleem.
Thank you.
It's a pleasure to have you again on this program.
I'm very happy to be on this program once again.
And congratulations on the publication of updated edition of Iron Wall. And let me start with the very first page in the book, where you raise a very interesting question, actually quoting a Russian-born teacher by the name of Yitzhak Epstein, who in 1907 wrote an article entitled "A Hidden Question." And the question is, among the grave questions raised by the concept of our people's renaissance on its own soil, there is one that is more weighty than all the others put together. There is the question of our relations with the Arabs. And then he goes on to say that this question has not been forgotten, but rather has remained completely hidden from the Zionists, and in its true form has found almost no mention in the literature of our movement. So would it be right for me to conclude that the Iron Wall is an attempt to answer this question?
Indeed, this is the key question about the Zionist movement, what Yitzhak Epstein, who was a teacher, called the hidden question in his 1907 article. He talks about the renaissance of the Jewish people. There is another term for this, which is Zionism, political Zionism. And the ultimate aim of political Zionism from the beginning was a Jewish state in Palestine. And the problem with this project was that there was already a community, an Arab community that had lived in Palestine for generations. And the great question for the leaders of Zionism was what to do with the existing Arab community in Palestine.
So they knew there was a community, but they chose to ignore it as if it didn't exist.
They did. Hence the title of the article, The Hidden Question. They hid the question because they couldn't confront it directly. They couldn't say that to achieve our aim, to build a Jewish state in Palestine, we would have to displace and dispossess the indigenous Arab population. They couldn't say that. So they skirted around the issue. They tried not to confront it head-on. They preferred to come up with answers for public consumption that did not involve admitting that there was an Arab question. So they said, our aim is a Jewish renaissance in our ancestral home, in our biblical homeland. And Zionist leaders also used to say that they don't want to harm anyone, they don't want to take anybody's rights, they would like to come and develop the country for the benefit of all its citizens. So that was the official answer of the Zionist movement. But the Zionist leaders were aware of the existence of a large number of Arabs in Palestine. When the Balfour Declaration was issued in 1917, there were roughly 600,000 Arabs and 58,000 Jews. So the Jews were just under 10% of the population. So this was, from the beginning, the hidden question.
So is this the idea of the Iron Wall, to erect a wall to enable you to completely not see what's on the other side?
Yes, the Iron Wall was the answer to the hidden question. And the Iron Wall strategy was articulated not by a labor Zionist, but by Ze'ev Jabotinsky, the spiritual father of the Israeli right. In 1923, he published an article called The Iron Wall, We and the Arabs. And his analysis went roughly as follows. He said, the Arabs are a nation. No nation in history has ever willingly given up its patrimony and made way for another people to come and create a state on its land. And therefore, it's a foregone conclusion that the Arabs would resist the Zionist project. So what should we do? And his answer was, the only way to build a Jewish state in Palestine is unilaterally and by military force. Diplomacy at the early stage would be ineffective because the Arabs would reject us. The only way to create a Jewish state in Palestine is behind an iron wall of Jewish military strength. So the Iron Wall was a means to an end to achieve a Jewish state in Palestine, and he predicted that the Arabs would hit their head against the wall, against the ramparts, until eventually they would give up any hope of defeating the Jews. And then, and only then, would be the time for stage 2 of the strategy, which is to negotiate with the Arabs about the rights and status in Palestine.
So it would have been unthinkable in the early stages for the Zionists to negotiate any settlement.
Yes, it was unthinkable because Arab resistance was inescapable. It was a given fact that the Arabs rejected the Zionist project. They were not prepared to have a Jewish state in their midst, and therefore negotiations would have been futile. The only way to overcome Arab resistance was by military force. And the other part of the Zionist strategy was what was known and is still known as creating facts on the ground, buying and taking over land in order not to have to negotiate and compromise over it. So another part of the strategy was creating facts on the ground, and this still continues to this very day under the Netanyahu government of constantly expanding Jewish settlements on the West Bank in order to preempt negotiations. So that was, from the beginning, the basic strategy of the Zionist movement in the confrontation with the Arabs, the strategy of the Iron Wall. Jabotinsky's successors were not as sophisticated as he was, because Jabotinsky had a subtle theory of change. He predicted that once the Arabs had given up any hope of defeating the Zionists on the battleground, there would be a shift in the leadership towards more moderates. Moderates will come to the fore, and that would make possible negotiations with them.
What did he have in mind? A two-state sort of solution?
I think less than a two-state solution, because he was a Jewish nationalist. He wanted a Jewish state in as large part of Palestine as possible. What he had in mind is more like autonomy for the local Arabs.
So the local Arabs would be part of the Zionist state,
yes,
but they'd have some sort of autonomy.
Autonomy within the within Greater Israel.
And I can see in the book that you really go through the history of the entire history of the State of Israel, addressing each phase under different leaderships, and that the concept of the Iron Wall never ceased to exist.
This is the thread that runs right through Israel's policy in this conflict with the Arabs. And in fact, I argue in the book that the history of the State of Israel is a vindication of the strategy of the Iron Wall, because in 1948, an independent Jewish state was created. And then this new state continued to deal with the Arabs from a position of unassailable military strength. This is the essence of the strategy of the Iron Wall, dealing with the Arabs from a position of great military strength, of military superiority.
So would you say that this concept was applied to what we call the Israeli Arabs, the Arabs who remained and became part of the Israeli state after it was founded in 1948?
No, that was a separate issue. After Israel was created in 1948, there was about 150,000 Palestinians who became citizens of the State of Israel. The strategy of the Iron Wall relates to the outside world, to the Arab world, to Israel's neighbors. And here I argue that the strategy worked. First, Egypt in 1979, then the PLO in 1993, then the following year, 1994, Jordan signed a peace treaty with Israel. So the strategy of negotiations from strength worked. But I also argue that in Israel's entire history, there was only one leader, Yitzhak Rabin, who moved from stage one of building military power to stage two, negotiating with the Palestinians about their rights and status in Palestine. And he did this by signing the Oslo Accord. And the Oslo Accord, for all its limitations, represented a historic compromise between the two nations in Palestine. And this historic compromise was clinched with the hesitant handshake between Yitzhak Rabin and Yasser Arafat. But sadly, 2 years later, Yitzhak Rabin was assassinated by a Jewish fanatic, and the whole of the Oslo process was derailed. So he was unique. He was the only one who went to stage two of the strategy. Now, we don't know what might have happened had Rabin not been assassinated. History doesn't disclose its alternatives. But my hunch is that had he survived, Yitzhak Rabin would have continued with the logic of the Oslo Accord, which is to proceed towards a two-state solution.
Now, where do we go from the current situation? I mean, Oslo has indeed created some sort of a reality, but well short of a permanent settlement or a comfortable settlement for both sides. It seems that the Iron Wall strategy is well in place.
After a brief interlude when Shimon Peres was prime minister, the Likud came back to power in 1996 under the leadership of Benjamin Netanyahu. And the question is, why did the Oslo peace process break down? And the official Israeli answer, it's because it was doomed to failure from the start, because it was a bad agreement. And my answer is that it was a modest step in the right direction, and the process failed because the Likud came back to power and reneged, went back on the Israeli side of the bargain. And the new prime minister was Benjamin Netanyahu, and he had never, in fairness to him, he never concealed his hostility towards the Oslo Accord. He always said that the Oslo Accord is incompatible with the right of the Jewish people to the whole land of Israel, and it's incompatible with the Israeli security. So he spent his first term in office from 1996 to 1999 in a largely successful effort to stop, to subvert, to undermine the Oslo Accords. that's why the Oslo Accords failed, and that's why today Netanyahu and his party and his more extreme right-wing coalition partners don't have a peace policy. They only have a policy of the iron wall, of acting unilaterally and avoiding negotiations and compromise.
But that period when Netanyahu did exactly what you've just described was followed by a Labour government. But that didn't really help much, and we ended up with the Camp David meetings or whatever that didn't really produce much.
Ehud Barak defeated Netanyahu in the elections of 1999, and the day after the Labour victory, I wrote the last sentence in the epilogue to the first edition of the Iron Wall, and I said that Ehud Barak's victory represents not just a political earthquake, but also the sunrise after the 3 dark and terrible years during which Israel had been led by the unreconstructed proponents of the Iron Wall. At the time, I thought that Ehud Barak represented hope. I pinned all my hopes in him. I thought that he was a soldier, former chief of staff. I thought he was the right man at the right place at the right time. And if he had a heart, his heart would have been in the right place. But he turned out to be the most terrible disappointment. He was in power for less than 2 years, and there was a Syrian track and a Palestinian track. And he went all out for a breakthrough on the Syrian track so that he wouldn't have to confront the hidden question, so that he wouldn't have to compromise with the Palestinians.
We keep going back to the hidden question.
We do. And we keep going back to the old strategy of the Israeli leaders of avoiding compromise with the other party, the other central party to the conflict, the Palestinians, and trying to strike deals with leaders of the neighboring Arab states. They did that with Sadat, they did that with King Hussein, and Ehud Barak tried to do it with Hafiz al-Assad of Syria. He went all out and he nearly achieved a breakthrough on the Syrian front. The Syrians were very cooperative and very willing, but it was he who got cold feet and backtracked, so he blew it.
Well, and he failed to arrive in Geneva.
Yes. So he was responsible for the failure of his strategy of Syria first. And then belatedly and reluctantly he turned to the Palestinian track. And the upshot was the Camp David summit of July 2000. And it was Barak who asked Clinton to organize the summit. And Yasser Arafat said to Clinton, "We're not ready. The gaps are too far. And if we have a summit meeting and it fails, it would make things worse rather than better." And Clinton said to him, "Well, come anyway, we'll do our best. And if we fail, there'll be no finger pointing. No one will accuse you." So they went to the summit, and Clinton and Barak ganged up. They tried to corner Arafat and force him into a settlement, but he didn't. He resisted. He didn't agree to a settlement on their terms. And then the first thing they did, both of them, was to point the finger at Arafat and to say he alone was responsible. And in this book I give the most detailed account of the diplomacy on the Palestinian track, with the climax at Camp David. And there is enough blame to go round. but the lion's share of the blame goes to Ehud Barak, who didn't have the courage for a real historic compromise with the Palestinians.
Now, I have just a couple of minutes more to go. Unfortunately, I would have loved to have an extended discussion on this. This edition has 4 new chapters. And these were intended to cover events afterwards. I guess when Sharon came to power and onwards. Now, what's the conclusion of the book?
There are 2 chapters on Ehud Barak, and then they are followed by 2 chapters on Ariel Sharon. And Ariel Sharon conducted what he called a war on terror during the Second Intifada, and he very clearly and openly shunned diplomacy. He was Prime Minister for 5 years, and negotiations on final status with the Palestinians never took place. And he was proud of the fact that under his watch there were no negotiations for a peace settlement with the Palestinians. So the final conclusion about the last 2 prime ministers, and then after that another 2 terms by Benjamin Netanyahu, the conclusion is the same as the story from the beginning. This is a 900-page book, but the crux of it is that since its creation, Israel has always been willing to resort to military force, ever ready to resort to military force on a massive scale, and remarkably reluctant to engage in serious diplomacy, in meaningful diplomacy with the Palestinians to find a resolution to this very prolonged, intense and bitter conflict.
Has it been translated to other languages?
It's been translated into 9 other languages, including Arabic and Hebrew, and there is a German edition and a Turkish edition in the pipeline.
Well, once again, congratulations, Professor Shleim, and it's been a pleasure having you once again on جسور.
Thank you very much for welcoming me.
وشكرا لكم على حسن المتابعة، وإلى لقاء قادم، والسلام عليكم ورحمة الله وبركاته.